Gavin here from Ultimate Reloader for Frankfurt Arsenal. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off in the unboxing video. We got everything out of the box. We got the press mounted to our bench. Now we're going to get the press configured and set up in preparation to set up for either pistol or rifle loading. The first thing I'm going to do is going to be to install all of the side cover plates, except the one covering the swaging and priming area so that we can make those adjustments prior to loading. When installing the side covers, you'll need a 2.5mm Allen key, which is included with the Frankfurt Arsenal X10, or you could use something like a ball end screwdriver tool. Next, we're going to install the handle. The handle is installed using the 5mm hex key included with the kit, and again, I like to use the ball end screwdriver type Allen keys. Now it's time to take off the tool head and the shell plate clamp. When loosening the tool head bolt, you're going to want that tool head in the bottom position so that the guide rods can help counteract that torque. I used a standard crescent wrench for that, and then I removed the 5 Allen screws from the shell plate clamp. That's a 3mm. I used a ball end. You can also use the hex key that's included with the X10 accessory tool kit. Next, we're going to swap out our primer and our swaging pins because I've got small. We're going to be loading 308, so I'm going to put in the large pins. Here's the good news. Removing and installing the priming and swaging pins is essentially the same exact process. You're going to crack the nut and then unscrew the appropriate pin, withdraw it from the top. Then install the new pin. They're laser engraved with both the size, large or small, and the type, swaging or priming. We're going to screw the pin back down while holding the nut, and that's going to just give a little clearance for the pin to turn. And then when it comes up flush at the bottom of the block, in both cases, that's going to be our initial dial-in for our setting, and we're going to tighten the nut. In a separate video, we're going to talk about the fine adjustment of both priming and swaging in their respective videos. Next, we're going to install the shell plate. The shell plate assembly will drop right into the press. You're going to hold back the plunger and carefully guide it into place. Note that there is a tight fit between the bearing on the shell plate assembly and the press base. Once you've got it in place, you're going to install the shell plate clamp with the 5 screws, carefully tighten them in sequence, and then finish torquing them after they're all seated. You're going to want to check to make sure that your press indexes when you cycle the handle. The indexing mechanism is pre-adjusted at the factory, but if you have to adjust that, we're going to cover that in a separate video. Now on to the priming system. This is a straightforward process, but there's some specific things you're going to want to pay special attention to. First is to index the press and make sure that the detent ball has located the shell plate where it should rest between strokes. The second is to rotate the gear on the priming assembly until you feel it hit its detent. You'll then insert the priming assembly from the side, insert the 4 screws, and tighten them, but don't torque them down. Make sure it's still able to free float. Lower the tool head, which will cause the priming pin to come up through the bottom of the shell plate cutout, and make sure it's perfectly centered in the cutout. Then torque down the 4 screws, and then index the press a couple times to make sure everything has settled in and is functioning properly. Now we're on to swapping out our locator buttons. So the way these buttons work is the button screws on from the top. There's a screw from the bottom with a spring in the middle. So what you're going to do is take the included Allen key and hold the screw from the bottom, use a flat blade screwdriver from the top, loosen the button, remove it, install the next one, get it started, and then use the screwdriver to tighten from the top. Pretty much the same exact process all the way around. Now we have a number 2 shell plate and we have the small head buttons installed here. And I have a 308 case. We're just going to double check to make sure that everything is correct. That's looking good. While we've got the tool head off and have got great access, we're going to swap out the case feed plunger. The first thing I did was to refer to the chart in the X10 owner's manual, which is going to give you the appropriate plunger and the appropriate reducer. This is the plunger here, has the appropriate profile to insert the case into the shell plate. The reducer has the appropriate length and diameter corresponding to the case that's going to be inserted into the press. There's 4 screws that hold down the housing. You're going to remove those, pull the housing off the press. That's going to give you access to the plunger screws. Remove those, put the new plunger on, reinsert them and gently torque them down finger tight, plus just a little bit. And then the actual reducer itself snaps into the housing. You can see this little feature here. You're going to want to push on that from the back side, push the plunger out, insert the new plunger, press it all the way in until it clicks. Then you're going to insert the housing back on the press, finger tighten the 4 screws, make sure it's aligned, and then torque those appropriately. Now we're ready to put the tool head back on. As you lower the tool head onto the press, you're going to want to make sure that you carefully align the hole at the back of the tool head with the alignment rod, and then guide the ram up through the central hole. You'll then take the tool head bolt, tighten that down by hand, lower the tool head, and then finish tightening so that you can ensure proper alignment. Cycle the press a couple times to make sure everything's aligned perfectly. Next, we're going to get the main powder measure assembly installed on the press. There's 2 nuts on the end of the return rod that need to be removed. Then you can slide the main assembly down. The die itself spins freely with respect to the main housing. So you can lower the die into the tool head until you see the threads just barely start to emerge from the bottom. Then we place the return rod lock nuts in place. We don't need to tighten those, and we don't need to tighten our lock ring. We'll adjust the height of the powder measure later. Now we can switch out to the activator. So you're going to start by loosening the screw that holds the return rod in place on the upper assembly, and then remove the shoulder bolts from the linkage plates. These linkage plates can then tip down, and then you can remove the entire upper assembly. That's going to expose the area where the activator sits. You can push up from the bottom with something like an Allen key. That'll lift it up out of the place so that you can grab it. Look in your chart to find the appropriate activator, drop that back in. Now, I'll make a note. From the factory, there's going to be some preservative oil to prevent corrosion. This is a great time to use something like brake cleaner or another solvent to get that off. You want all of those metal parts where the powder will contact to be bone dry and completely lacking in any kind of grease or lubrication. That's just going to make the powder measure work a lot better. Once you've got the activator in place, you can then carefully take the return rod, return it up to its appropriate height. It's going to be spring loaded. You're going to have to kind of feel for that and do a visual to get that screw aligned again. Lightly torque that back down, swing the plates up, and put the shoulder bolts back in place. You might have to lift the upper portion of the powder measure assembly here to get those holes to line up perfectly. Be very careful not to cross thread those screws. Once we've got all that complete, we can then put our reservoir and our baffle in place. When dropping in the powder baffle, you're going to want to look at the front arrows. Those front arrows should point towards you when you're standing behind the press. The reservoir then slides in. There's 2 small set screws. You're going to want to tighten them in until they're about flush with the housing. You'll feel just a tiny bit of torque. Again, don't over tighten. That would be easy to do. Next, we're going to talk about installing the case feed collator stand and bin brackets. Get that case feed system underway. The collator stand consists of the lower stand, the upper stand, and a coupler. There's 4 screws total that use a 5mm hex key, 2 for the coupler to join the 2 stand sections together, and 2 to attach the entire stand assembly to the press frame. Note the orientation here of the bin brackets. There's a larger bracket pointing away from you, standing behind the press. That's going to be for completed cartridges. And then we've got another bin bracket coming out the side for bullets or other items you want to use next to the press. So for case feed plates, there's only 2 for small pistol, large pistol, small rifle, and large rifle. There's adjustable, reversible feet on the pistol feed plate, and that's going to adjust the height depending on the length of the case that you're feeding. The rifle is universal and will feed cases like 308 Invariance, 300 Blackout, 223, and others. So this just drops in the top. We're going to rotate it until we've aligned the splines with the hub. Good to go. Now we can drop the collator onto the stand and hook up our power. To wrap up our initial setup of the X10, we're going to install the low primer sensor, some electrical cables, and a couple other small parts. The low primer sensor slides right over the top of the priming assembly and is connected to the tool head via a single 3.5mm cable. To test it, we need to hook up our main power on the back of the tool head. There's also a strain relief here which prevents the cord from getting bound up, and that's held with a single screw. Once we've got power hooked up, we can turn the light on and off with the power switch, and we can test our low primer sensing. So not only do we get an audible chirp, we also get an alternating flashing of the light, which is awesome. After installing those components, I slid the cartridge deflector down in the track, secured the 2 screws, and then turned my attention to the swaging hold-down die. The tool head was lowered to its bottommost position, the die screwed in until it contacts the shell plate, and then the lock ring was secured in place. With initial setup complete, this machine is ready for final caliber specific setup procedures and tweaks. You'll find those videos and more at frankfortarsenal.com.